Japan's new Prime Minister is known as a China hawk in the spirit of her mentor, former PM, the late Shinzo Abe. In May 2025, Takaichi Sanae called for a, quote, quasi-alliance between India, Taiwan, Australia, the EU and Japan to protect each other's security and safety. This is Takaichi on her election win.
私は今、嬉しいというよりも、本当にこれからが大変なことだ。皆様と一緒に力を合わせてやらなきゃいけないことが山ほどある。そう思っております。たくさんの政策、それもスピーディーに実行しなければいけないこと、たくさんございます。
What is behind Takaichi's idea of a, quote, quasi-alliance to protect security in the region? And following a recent security cooperation deal, could India and Japan deepen ties with a defence partnership, especially in light of the recent Pakistan-Saudi mutual defence deal? Finally, why do India and Japan share such a strong relationship? Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Min Kavat. To discuss these stories and more, we are joined by Pradeep Chauhan, Indian Navy Vice Admiral retired and former Indian Western Naval Command Chief of Staff. And he is currently National Maritime Foundation India Director General. We also have Michael Chen, Democratic Progressive Party International Affairs Director. Admiral, it's a great privilege to have you on Taiwan Talks today.
Thank you so much.
And welcome back, Michael.
Thank you.
So, Admiral, let me come to you first. Before becoming PM, Ishiba Shigeru actually had suggested an Asian NATO. Takaichi has not gone that far, certainly nothing that includes an Article 5 mutual defence treaty. Do you believe that this quasi-alliance is more feasible?
Well, let me first try and explain what I understand is meant by an alliance, first of all. You're aware that the government of India has a almost policy stance on the matter of alliances. India does not enter into a military alliance with anybody, nor do I think India is likely to do so. So as an alternative, if you might consider that, what India has done is create a series of strategic partnerships. You find that there is a hierarchy, if you might call it that, of India's strategic partnerships. And very nearly at the apex of that is Japan. What the Prime Minister probably meant to say was that we need to find some bonding and a manner in which our strategic concerns and our strategic interests can coincide. And I think that might be what she wanted to say.
Having said that, though, in terms of the countries that she's identified, it would seem that it would be similar to Quad, which is a quasi-alliance, not limited to military, but swapping out US for the EU, and then perhaps because she was on a trip to Taiwan, she mentioned Taiwan. Obviously, Taiwan's security would be key to this.
Of course. First of all, I do not think that the Quad is an alliance either. I think
a quasi-alliance.
The Quad is better described as a dialogue, and I'm not really trying to split hair here. I'm just trying to say that a dialogue does not have the same connotations as does an alliance or even a quasi-alliance. What it does is that it tries to identify what are common interests rather than only concentrating upon common threats. And then if those common interests are being addressed adversely by one or more player in the world, then that would then constitute a common threat which would need to be addressed. Taiwan, and you're being a bit self-deprecating by saying that Taiwan was probably included because the Prime Minister was here.
Only because of the pressure that China exerts on every single country in the world.
That is correct. So China, by itself, the government of China exerts a malevolent influence on almost everything that it chances upon. And to that extent, the situation with regard to China and is quite common between India and Taiwan. Let me expand on that for a second or two. And, you know, we don't pose a threat to China because we build aircraft carriers or we build submarines or we do drones or we have advanced missilery. None of these. We pose a threat to China because we exist. We present a political option that while India was poor, while India was lacking agency, it was always possible for China to point out to India as an example of what might go wrong. And yet, we are developing. We are a nation whose economy is galloping. We are a nation with demography on our side and an enormously vibrant startup culture. So we are every year pulling hundreds of thousands of people out of poverty. Now this presents the Chinese people with an alternative model to say maybe you don't need to have a single party rule with a single dictator on the top. Maybe there's another one, and this is anathema to the Communist Party of China. Taiwan is identical to us in the sense of exactly the same situation ever since Taiwan embraced full forms of democracy. And so for us, I mean, we're stuck in the gullet of the Chinese Communist parties as something that presents, as I said, an anathema to their continuation of their rule.
Just going back to the relationship between Takaichi and Shinzo Abe. Now, Quad was actually the brainchild in 2007 of Shinzo Abe. Do you think that Takaichi might almost be wanting to take a leaf out of the book of her mentor by suggesting something perhaps as grand as this quasi-alliance that she speaks about? And very interesting to contrast it then perhaps with what analysts have said Abe's 3 goals were in establishing Quad. Number 1, strengthen Japan's defenses. Number 2, buttress a free and open Indo-Pacific. And 3rd, draw the US into the Indo-Pacific to not retrench in the face of China.
Well, I think with Takaichi at the helm, Japan is signaling something more assertive. And certainly, there are a lot of similarities between what she's proposing and what Abe is proposing. But actually what I had in mind was the arc of freedom and prosperity, which was also under Abe's first prime ministership and with Aso Taro as foreign minister. Now this concept of kind of Japan, Australia, India, and then an arc up all the way to Europe. If you look at that and compare it to what Takaichi has said with her idea of this quasi-alliance, it's pretty much, you see a lot of the same ideas. And I think it's not something that is to replace the Quad. And if we look at kind of the statements made during the conception of the Arc of Freedom and Prosperity, it's been made clear that this is something that will complement the foundation of the U.S.-Japan alliance, that the cornerstone of Japan's foreign policy will remain the U.S.-Japan alliance. And I think that's what we're going to see if Takaichi actually implements this idea of a quasi-alliance when she comes into power.
And what do you think, Michael, about, when she called for this in May in Taiwan, she did talk about the US's, quote, unreliability. So do you see that, obviously that people can see this as her balancing and hedging back then, will that last into office?
Yes, I think this is a hedge. Japan wants to diversify its security ties beyond sole reliance on the US. Hence the recent Japan-India security declaration, and hence this idea of this quasi-security alliance. But I think there's every reason to believe that the US-Japan alliance will remain the cornerstone of that of Japan's foreign policy.
Okay, Admiral, you've had 40 years in the Navy, retiring in 2013. I wanted to get your perspective on. You've talked about the similarities, the parallels between Taiwan and India in regard to China. From your perspective, what are the best options for Taiwan in terms of coalition building to deter China?
Okay, so I think that Taiwan's central challenge remains twofold. This is a bit of an oxymoron, but it remains twofold in the sense that, first of all, Taiwan must make must continue to make, it's making very valiant efforts to move to a de jure status as a state. And this is, of course, nothing that is new to the Taiwanese, whether the people or the government. But the second is that if it wants to do coalition building of some sort, then we must recognize that the greatest strength of Taiwan is also, in many ways, its greatest weakness. Its greatest strength is the relationship that it enjoys with the United States. This is also its greatest weakness, particularly when United States administrations tend to come up with peculiar statements, as in, we should do 50-50 and things of this nature. So this reminds everybody that it is brittle. Any single basket in which you've placed almost all your eggs is going to be problematic should that basket turn out to be less robust than you thought it would be. That having been said, let me try and double back on the point that you made with regard to Japan and India and Australia and the EU and Taiwan. And I think that there's a real possibility here, provided we are clever about it and provided we are able to contest China's strategic communications. And where we lose out is we're really good. As a naval officer, I can tell you that if I was to pit one Indian current combatant against one Chinese current combatant, I'll put all my money on the Indian one. And this is not something that I'm saying out of national pride. It is my best assessment. If, on the other hand, you put 1 against 60, then the situation changes. So it is in our interest to make sure that 60 don't show up. That's a separate fallout of this coalition building business. But when you talk about the Chinese strategic communication, China has us is spinning loops around us. Do we therefore have a coalition building strategy? Yes? No? If the answer is no, then we better get back to our notebooks and start devising one. And if the answer is yes, we better start executing it. My problem is that when Taiwan and India talk to one another, they very seldom have these conversations. The conversations sort of stop at Foxconn, or they stop at TSMC or PSMC or Tata's, all of which is important. But all of this fits in a grander basket. And if our people, our leaderships, are going to get their eyes glazed over whenever we start talking about this at this level, then we're going to lose. Because the other guy, namely China, is playing simultaneously at the strategic level, at the operational level, and at the level of tactics. Can we lift our game? I don't know. I don't know the answer. I certainly hope so, but hope is never a good strategy.
Yes, I've heard that before. Now, in this show, we'll focus on the India-Japan relationship. Let's look at their existing defense ties. This is a stealth Unicorn mast, which optimizes a ship's radar and communication and reduces its signature. It represents a milestone because it marked Japan's first defense technology export to India under Japan's restricted export policy. Then, of course, is the Malabar naval exercise between the 4 Quad members of India, Australia, Japan, and the US, improving their carrier operations, anti-submarine warfare, air defense, and logistics. 2025's iteration is due to be held by the US off Guam in the next several weeks. And at the end of August, on a visit to Japan by Indian PM Narendra Modi, the two sides signed a defense cooperation agreement to increase interoperability and synergy between their defense forces, working toward their shared maritime security goals and naval and coast guard cooperation within common regional and global security objectives. Michael, let me ask you, do you see the possibility for India-Japan bilateral ties to deepen beyond what we see here? Well, that deal was signed at the end of August, especially now that Takaichi Sanae has come on board.
Well, certainly. I think there's real potential for that, for an intensification of Japan-India relations. Certainly the recent agreement was a big milestone in signaling kind of deeper security cooperation between the two countries. And I think that under her, Japan will be more willing, probably, to kind of have bigger defense budgets, be more willing to pursue joint development programs, expand logistics, basing support, and explore kind of interoperability.
Because it was also Abe that reached out to India,
right?
In the early 2000s.
Right, indeed, and I think there's every reason to believe that Takaichi will continue that strategy. I think it fits into that vision of a quasi-alliance. I think even a Japan-India kind of quasi-alliance between the two would be very significant in kind of countering China's expansion in the Indo-Pacific.
Admiral, though you have mentioned, of course, Delhi's policy is not to enter into especially military alliances. Do you see that there's scope for more deepening of security ties, or do you believe that this is more or less where it will be?
No, as a matter of fact, I entirely agree that this agreement is probably the most comprehensive upgrade in the relationship within the security paradigm between India and Japan since the inception of their, since the earlier one in 2008. So we've got several years having gone by. So I think that the 6 pillars that have been outlined in this and the many prospects per pillar are all indicative of a significant deepening of ties. We now have a situation where both the countries are in fact moving along very similar aspirational paths. So I think that this is probably going to result in a quasi-alliance, even if we won't use the word. So it will, in fact, move Japan away from this business of outpricing itself and dealing with buying and selling into a much more Indian acceptable model of joint development. And this is the model, incidentally, that I think needs to be pursued with Taiwan too. It isn't what Taiwan can buy from India, what India can buy from Taiwan. It is what the two of them can jointly develop.
Right. And Admiral, let me just ask you, so in terms of that Pakistan-Saudi mutual defense treaty, not just an alliance, does that give more appetite in New Delhi to strengthening different bilateral relations, and especially with Japan?
Yes, of course it does. Of course it does. On the one hand, the track that New Delhi is following is to leverage its own relationships with Saudi Arabia. So does this come as a rude shock to New Delhi? Notwithstanding the brave faces that politicians must put on, I dare say it does. Does it lead us to having greater appetite for a relationship more likely to last, namely with Japan? Most certainly it does. So will it drive the India-Japan relationship? I doubt. Will it accelerate the India-Japan relationship? Beyond a doubt.
Right.
So it isn't going to be the driver.
Right. And what does India, let me ask Michael first to bring him in, what does Japan gain from India, firstly?
Well, I think Japan wants to diversify its security ties, first of all. And I think there's a lot of interest in strengthening relations with India. Of course, Japan had been known as, in terms of the relationship with India, more kind of support on land, as in kind of infrastructure and high-speed rails, et cetera. But in the last 10 years or so, it's shifted towards the seas, because that's where it really counts. That's where the maritime domain is where it matters. So I think Japan has a lot to gain in strengthening this relationship.
And Admiral?
Yeah, I tend to echo that in large measure. It presents Japan with a genuine opportunity to diversify its security baskets. India is no longer, as I said, seen as a receiver, an importer alone of defense equipment. It is increasingly being seen as one of the larger defense exporters. And we're not talking about things like Kevlar suits, etc. We're talking about high-end stuff.
BrahMos missiles?
BrahMos missiles, not just BrahMos missiles, but joint ventures like BrahMos are in fact the way forward. But we're now in a position where both of us can genuinely gain, both in the immediate as well as in the more distant timelines or time frames. So I think that this is a relationship which is definitely going places.
Okay. Now let's talk about some of the long-term ties that exist between the two. So India and Japan relations are civilizational, cultural and spiritual, dating back to the early centuries through the spread of Buddhism to Japan and shaping Japan's Shinto religion today. Fast forward to the 20th century in 1905, Japan's victory over Russia energized India to see an Asian nation defeating a major Western opponent, instilling confidence that British colonial rule could be challenged and giving birth to a pan-Asian solidarity. That Asian unity bloomed with India's Nobel Prize-winning Rabindranath Tagore's visits to and love affair with Japan, which he urged to work with India as guardians of Asian civilization. During World War II, Indian nationalist Netaji Supas Chandra Bose worked with Japan to raise the Indian National Army, or INA, aimed at liberating India from British rule, which finally occurred in 1947. Finally, India's 1952 peace treaty with Japan made it one of the first countries to normalize relations with Japan after World War II, independent of the Allied powers. Michael, let me ask you, so how would you characterize relations between what's been called the bookends of Asia, the Indo-Pacific?
Well, Ian, I think you just listed all the reasons and the history behind the relationship between the two countries, which is one that has its roots from the 1900s, right? From, as you mentioned, the 1905 victory of Japan over Russia, 1952 when India established ties with Japan. India refused, by the way, to sign the San Francisco Peace Treaty, believing that Japan and India should pursue a more equal relationship based on reciprocity and equality. So there's a lot of that history behind it and a lot of that historical goodwill that kind of adds context to the two countries' relationship today. What they're pursuing today is more is strategic, but given the historical context, it helps us understand it better and more than just a transactional mechanism.
Admiral, would you agree with that analysis?
We often tend to give short shrift to history, and this is a great pity because civilizational linkages are enduring ones, whereas a given administration, no country, even in the modern context, should have its foreign policy or its defense policy wrapped around a 4-year tenure of any administration. That would be short-sighted in the extreme. The relationship between India and Japan is one where the amount of contribution made by the Indian National Army under Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose has also regrettably frequently under Anglophile kind of literature been cast away as some sort of rebellion or some sort of revolution, which was something close to a mutiny. But in actual fact, this particular, the raising of the Indian National Army was a serious jolt to the British, who realized that they could no longer rely upon the supposed loyalty of the Indian Army. And that, I think, was a significant driver in arriving at independence in 1947. It doesn't matter whether Shinzo Abe lived or didn't live, or whether Takaichi will or will not. What matters is that two countries are not looking at each other as nation states in the Westphalian tradition, but as nations, as civilizations which transcend many millennia before Westphalia.
This idea of India and Japan sort of being natural partners, or what we're talking about is that Asian solidarity, that Pan-Asian unity that emerged rather than sort of defeating a Western empire now, is the rival or the enemy China, and where we have two great, essentially Asian giants who could come together and use that as leverage to ensure that it's not a China-led 21st century.
Well, I think, yes, one could say that India and Japan are natural partners in this. And we can compare it to the 1900s when India looked at Japan defeating Russia and seeing it as a model to push back against this Western power. Whereas here today, that power is China, of course. I think, I think it certainly resonates, except that today, the rival is China, and it makes the contest much more complex. And China is presenting a bigger and more direct threat to the region, to India, to Japan, and to others in the area. So yes, I think absolutely there's this kind of similarity there behind
so the mirroring or
yes,
resonance.
Indeed.
Okay.
I want to go back to your earlier question because I have a disagreement here.
Okay.
And it's about time that we had at least one disagreement. And that is that, the ability of China now to utilize this very same concept of an Asian David championing, China being the Asian David championing Asia against the rampaging and pillaging West under as the Western Goliath, I think is exactly the kind of thing that we need to be careful about. And then it comes to your question about can India and China sort of work together?
India and Japan.
India and China work together? No. Can India and Japan work together? Most certainly, as we've already said. So would that then be some sort of diminishing of the Asian ability and confidence? I think that that is exactly what China is seeking to push out as its most basic strategic communication. That it provides much of South Asia and Southeast Asia with a subliminal messaging that, of China being the real champion. Now, if Japan and India can come together and are coming together, then they can present both continuation of the fact that it is an Asian century and refutation of the fact that it needs necessarily to be a Chinese determined century. Look, everybody's familiar with India's shape. It's like an inverted triangle. On the top axis, on the top line, one vertex is Pakistan, whose main import and export is terrorism. And on the other side, the other vertex is China, whose main intent seems to be to change the shape of this triangle. So the only way that India can go forward is by leveraging the two sides which constitute the peninsula of India. Port-led development, coastal agglomeration resilience. These are the things that will take us forward. And that is why India is making this very marked shift to overcome its centuries of sea blindness imposed once again regrettably by the British, since they had the Royal Navy who provided for all of these features. But now India recognizes that we better stand up on our own, and how we do will depend upon how adroitly, how adeptly, how skillfully we are able to dance upon the maritime stage.
Well, we're going to have to end it there. Thank you so much to our special guest, Pradeep Chawan, and Michael again.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure.
If you liked our show, please search for us on YouTube, give us a thumbs up, and hit subscribe to our channel. Thank you for watching the show today. Stay safe and see you next time.